Bobby Jindal.
Thank you all very much for that very warm reception. It's great to be back with you. Indeed, I remember standing in this building in 2003 speaking to you all as well. We had a great crowd back then as well. You know, it's amazing to me, 100 years ago this year, 100 years ago this year was born a great man and a great leader for our country. Ronald Reagan was born 100 years ago, and I'd argue one of the greatest presidents in our country's history. I want you to think about the challenges he confronted as the president of this great country. At the time, if you listened to the intellectuals, you read the editorial pages of the newspapers of this great country, they would tell you America cannot win the Cold War. They told you it was simply foolish to think that the forces of freedom could win against the forces of communism. They said the best we could do would be to seek appeasement. At the same time, there was something called the misery index. You may remember people measured unemployment in double digits, inflation in double digits. They had a term called stagflation. We used to add up inflation and unemployment and come up with what was then called the misery index. People had stopped believing in America. Ronald Reagan did many great things as a leader, not only for our party, but as the president of this great country. Certainly, I would argue that he led the fight that helped to beat the forces of communism. The second time in modern history that America has been called on to lead the forces of freedom, to defend the free world. The first time against fascism in World War II, the second time in the Cold War, and the third time, I would argue, we're being called on right now to fight against fundamentalist Islamic terrorism. Once again, to lead the fight to defend the free world. Now, of course, we're allied with many other countries, many other people, but America has been called to lead that fight. The second thing that President Reagan did for us was he allowed Americans to believe in America again. He turned that economy around. He proved that, yes, we could compete, not only with Japan, but other countries across this world, and that we could again claim to be the most competitive, the most prosperous, the most productive country in the entire world. Now, I would argue today, I want to focus on the challenges confronting us domestically. I would argue today that we face challenges similar to what President Reagan confronted back at the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s. I would argue today that as Americans, we face a great challenge. And that challenge is this. We must not become the first generation that leaves fewer opportunities for our children and our grandchildren than we inherited from our parents. I mean, think about it, that's essentially the American dream. The American dream is that if our children work hard, play by the rules, get an education, they should be able to do even better than we've done. Yet that American dream, that very American dream, is at risk. And what do I mean by that? We're in the middle of the greatest recession since the Great Depression. Now, I know in Washington, the economists will tell you that the recession's over, and that's nonsense. As long as unemployment is as high as it is, as long as foreclosures continue across our country, nobody can argue this recession is over. Yet look at the solutions coming out of Washington, D.C. The good news is they tell you they have a plan. Do you realize they have borrowed $14 trillion in our name? I want to repeat that, $14 trillion of debt in our name. What does that mean to you and me? That's $45,000 for every person in this room. Don't worry, they've got a plan. Over the next decade, they want to almost double that to $26 trillion. That is their plan. Let me tell you something. There has never been a country in the history of the world that has borrowed, spent, or taxed itself into prosperity. And we're not going to become the first. The reality is, if we continue to spend more than we take in, we know what's going to happen. Inflation rates will go up, interest rates will go up, Chinese won't keep buying our debt, our quality of life will go down, not up for the next generation. We'll be the first generation that mortgages our children's future, that leaves fewer opportunities and more debt to them than we inherited from our parents. Yet there is a different way. And I would argue that that way is being shown in states all across this country. You know, here in Louisiana, when I took my inaugural oath, January 14th, 2008, I made a commitment to you. I made a fundamental promise to you. I promised you that we would work together to create a new Louisiana. I told you we would work together to stop exporting our greatest assets. Our greatest exports aren't the crops we grow, it's not the oil, the gas we drill, it's not even the products we make. For 25 years, our greatest exports have been our sons and daughters. We have been the only state in the South that has consistently, for 25 years, sent more people out of the state than moved back into our state. And I told you we had to work together to create a new Louisiana to keep our children and grandchildren at home, to bring them back. I want to share with you just a few numbers about how we have done, but then I want to tell you the 5 critical decisions I think that we have made and we must continue to make if we want to stay on this path. First, a few numbers. You may have seen just a couple of weeks ago that Site Selection ranked Louisiana 3rd best in the country for economic development wins, #1 in the country in terms of per capita wins, highest ranking we've ever received as a state. Site Selection also named Louisiana the most improved state in the country. Paulina has ranked us the most improved state in the country. Business Facilities recently ranked Louisiana the State of the Year for 2010. Gallup said we're the 3rd best state at creating jobs. Portfolio.com said we had the 2nd best economic performance during the recession. Our unemployment rate has been below the Southern average every single month since January 2008. Southern Business Development has named Louisiana the State of the Year 2 years in a row with Tennessee. They said we had more per capita economic development than any other state in the South 2 years in a row. You've seen it in ranking after ranking, rating after rating. Moody's says we're one of the first 11 states to come out of the recession. 5th best GDP growth in the entire country. And the list go on and on and on, but here's the most important number. Most important number is after 25 years of losing our young people. For 3 years in a row, we've had more people move into Louisiana rather than leave the state. We have outgrown the rest of the country 40%, by 40% over these last 3 years. But this didn't happen by accident. The reality is, I would argue it's because of 5 critical steps we have taken to begin to bring our children home. And by the way, we can't declare victory. Nobody in this room should be complacent and say the job is done until every child can pursue their dreams here. I'm glad that we're outperforming our other states in the South. I'm glad we're outperforming the rest of the country. We've got a lot more work to do. And we can't declare victory until every child comes home, every child stays here. But I would argue for you it is because of 5 critical decisions we have made. I also said something else on Inauguration Day. I told you on that day we had to start by waging war on corruption and incompetence. Within our first 30 days, we had a special session on ethics. Now, why was that so important? The reality is that people across this country thought that in Louisiana there was a Louisiana way to do business. They used to joke that who you knew was more important than what you knew. Billy Tozan used to make the joke that half of his constituents were underwater at any given moment in time, the other half were under indictment at any given moment in time. Problem was, LSU did a study, and they said that one of the top things we could do to attract business was to crack down on corruption. Business leaders across the country said they didn't want to invest here given that perception. I won't go through the dozens of bills we passed during that session. I'll tell you 2 numbers. Center for Public Integrity used to rank Louisiana 44th worst for legislative disclosure in the entire country. Today we don't rank 44th worst. Today Louisiana ranks #1 in the entire country. Better Government Association used to say that Louisiana ranked in the bottom 5 on their integrity index. Today we don't rank in the bottom 5. Today BGA says we rank in the top 5 in that same integrity index. You know, it was never about ratings or rankings. It was about creating jobs. And that's why we took a second step, and I want to spend most of my time on this second step. We had a second special session. We came into session, and we got rid of the taxes on debt, new equipment, utilities. Later that year, we enacted the largest income tax cut in our state's history. Now, why is that so important? You know, none of our neighboring states had those taxes I just named on debt, new equipment, utilities. Our tax code was the greatest gift we could give our neighboring states. I mean, look, you don't have to be a PhD in economics to understand. If you want to encourage an activity, don't tax it. If you want to discourage an activity, tax it. Business told us their newest equipment in Louisiana was older than their oldest equipment anywhere else. They told us it's more expensive to invest in Louisiana. We're going to go to Mississippi and Texas and these other states across the country. And that's why not only did we get rid of those taxes, I made a simple promise to you, both as a candidate and as governor. And I told you, as long as I'm your governor, we are not raising taxes in the state of Louisiana, period. I want to spend some time talking about this because I believe this is going to be the most fundamental choice we face as a state and one of the toughest challenges we'll face during the upcoming regular session. Every governor across this country has got to make this fundamental decision. These are tough economic times, make no mistake about it. And every state is having to tighten their belt and do more with less. But every state's got one fundamental decision to make. Do you make the tough choices in state government, or do you shift this burden to your people and your businesses already struggling to pay their bills? And there's no shortage of people recommending that we find a way to raise taxes. There are legislators, Democratic and Republican, who've already floated proposals. Governor, why are you so stubborn on taxes? Why don't you just raise taxes on oil and gas? They're drilling for oil and gas in the Haynesville Shale. Governor, why don't you at least suspend that tax exemption so they pay, we can collect $200 million. Why don't you just raise income taxes on the wealthy? They can afford to pay it. Why don't you reverse this daily income tax cut? Governor, why don't you just tax certain products? Polls show that people will be happy to vote for higher taxes on other people. I also think that's great. Everybody's willing to impose a tax on their neighbors. You don't smoke, you want to tax the smokers. You don't eat Twinkies, you want to tax those that do. You don't drink sodas, you want to tax those that drink sodas. And the list goes on and on and on. Indeed, the local paper, there was an editorial just a couple of days ago. Why won't the government just be reasonable and compromise on taxes? Well, it's pretty simple to me. For years, that is exactly what Louisiana has done. Every time we have faced a fiscal challenge, we've either expanded gambling or we have raised taxes. We've got to show the people of our state and the investors and businesses across this country that want to invest in Louisiana that we have changed our state. That this is a new Louisiana. That we will make the commitment to shrink our government, live within our means, because every family and business is having to do the same thing. We've cut spending 26% overall since we've taken office. 27%. That means that we've cut spending by over $9 billion. Our state general funds are now down to where they last were in 2006. I'm not talking about the federal government where they talk about cutting spending by cutting the growth in government. I'm saying we're actually cutting spending. We have now eliminated between 6,000 and 7,000 funded government positions. By the way, we have privatized our group home services. We used to spend $500 a day providing these services. Now we do it for $200 a day working with the private sector. Sold off 10% of the state's car fleet. We've made priorities, we have cut spending, and we're going to have to continue to do that in next year's budget, by the way. I proposed a budget that cuts one-time funding by 75% compared to last year's budget. I proposed a budget that's certainly not perfect. And there are a number of legislators in this room, and I look forward to them changing the budget. I'm sure the House will improve it, the Senate will improve it after them, and by the way, we'll rewrite it all over again in June. We do that every year. And that's a healthy process. That's a part of the democratic debate that needs to happen. But let us be clear about one thing. All across this country, this same fight is happening. It's happening in New Jersey with Chris Christie. It's happening in Wisconsin with Scott Walker. It is happening in every state. Let's give Scott a round of applause. Scott is a friend, and I was proud to have gone and campaigned for him. I went and campaigned for Christie. I went and campaigned for a lot of these guys, and I'm excited to see the brave moves they're making in their states. And in state capitals across this country, people are making the same arguments. They're having the same fight. And it's a pretty fundamental fight. Can we cut spending? Can we balance our budgets without raising taxes? Or do we simply shift this burden to families and businesses? In Illinois, they raised income taxes by something like 75%, between 66 and 75%. In California, they want to, quote, temporarily continue to increase their taxes. And the list goes on and on between those states that have chosen to increase their taxes and other states that are choosing to balance their budgets like Louisiana. Now, the reason I wanted to spend a few minutes on this, I guarantee you this upcoming regular session, this will be the debate. This will be the debate. People will say, Governor, we don't want to privatize those services. We don't want to sell those prisons. We don't want to cut that spending. Instead, we want to raise taxes. Now, I'm here to tell you one of the reasons we've outperformed the national and southern economies. We made a commitment to businesses that want to invest in our state. We made a commitment to families that are moving back into our state. We've said we'll give you a predictable and level playing field. We're not going to raise your taxes. We're not going to change the rules once you invest here and once you come here. This is perhaps the most important debate we're going to have. It is the most important debate. Now, we'll have other debates this session, but it is the most important debate about the message it sends to our people and the businesses that want to invest in our state about what kind of state we're creating for our children and grandchildren. Third thing we've done. We continue to invest in workforce training. 70% of the companies who want to move here or expand here tell us one of their top 2 concerns is finding a skilled worker. We now have the top-ranked workforce training program in the entire country. and we offer a day one guarantee, saying our kids will be ready to work on the first day or we'll retrain them for free. Fourth thing we've done, we continue to improve pre-K through 12 education. I won't go through all the new charter bills we passed and the Teacher Value Added Assessment Act we passed, the Rate Tape Reduction Act. I will tell you this. We passed a Teacher's Bill of Rights. One of the most important things we could do. Number one reason we lose good teachers, we're still paying at or above the Southern average. Number one reason we lose good teachers in this state, it's the environment in our classrooms. It's the lack of discipline in our classrooms. My mother-in-law, my father-in-law are here, they can tell you this. When my wife and I, when we were growing up, she graduated from public schools right here in Jefferson Parish. I graduated from public schools in Baton Rouge. We can tell you this. When we were growing up, we listened to our teachers. Because we were more afraid of our parents than our teachers. I'll just tell you about my parents. I begged my teachers, do whatever you want, because when I got home, I just got into more trouble. My dad had a pretty simple philosophy. He spanked me no matter what. He'd say, son, if you didn't do what the teacher said, I'm sure you did something else. We'll just call it even. Don't worry about it. That was his idea of justice. It's not like that in today's classroom. Go visit a classroom today. I'm proud of the reforms in New Orleans. I'm proud of a lot of the great work that's happened across the state. But you go into the classrooms today. Teachers will tell you time after time the parents are coming and yelling at them, making excuses for their children. Now I'm here to tell you, we've passed tough laws. We've said if students don't show up ready to learn, they can lose their driver's licenses. That parents can be required to come in on weekends and after school, and they can lose their licenses as well. But I'm here to tell you, it takes more than laws. We as parents need to stop making excuses for our children. We need to support those teachers because there'll be nobody to make excuses for those children when they grow up, when they go to get jobs, when they enter into the real world. I also want to talk to you for just a few minutes about what I think is the most important higher education legislation we've passed today. And that's the Louisiana Grad Act. And that act was intended and is designed to reward performance. I can tell you a lot about higher education. I'll tell you just one number. We've got the second lowest graduation rate in the entire South. Now what does that mean? That means over 60% of our students don't graduate even after 6 years in school. What does that mean? It means we rank 13th worst in the country in terms of what we spend on students who drop out with a year or less of education. Over $200 million last 5-6 years alone. That is bad for students who don't end up with the degrees and the skills they need. That is bad for taxpayers who end up spending all that money on students who don't end up graduating and getting the degrees they need. It is bad for our state. Now you'll hear all kinds of excuses. Whenever you talk about performance, people want to tell you, well, look at the demographics. Look at our students, look at their preparation before they get to the campus. You'll hear all kinds of excuses. And I'm here to tell you that's nonsense. If we rank second worst in the South in football, every one of you want to fire the coach. Look, I don't know what would have happened if LSU lost the Cotton Bowl. Think of all the pressure that would have been put on LSU. You would never, imagine if the LSU football coach came to you and said, look, we had a lousy season, but the kids in Texas are bigger, they're faster, they're stronger. That's nonsense. If they offer those excuses, we'd run the coach out of town. If we're not willing to accept those excuses on the football field, we shouldn't accept those excuses in the classroom, in our research laboratories either. We should demand excellence from higher education. That's why we're changing the funding formula, and that's why we passed the Grad Act. To say, let's not just pay for schools to be bigger, let's pay for them to be better. And I want to talk about a controversy that's been in the papers, been on the news, and I'm sure you'll see it on your TV news tonight when you go home. You know, I asked the Board of Regents to look at a proposal. I said, it just seems to me like it makes sense to look at the idea. We've got two public universities blocks apart in the city of New Orleans. The University of New Orleans, the Southern University of New Orleans. You've got two universities, two colleges that don't use their buildings 50% of the time. You've got neither of them getting the retention graduation rates you'd like to see. At SUNO, I said it was a 5% graduation rate after 6 years. At the same time, you've got Delgado bursting at the seams. More students, they had to turn away students a year ago because they didn't have enough building or facilities for them. I said it just makes sense to me that we should look at combining those two colleges, putting them in the University of Louisiana system, and requiring that combined university to then work with Delgado, the local community college. Now, I want to be fair to the other side. You've only heard one side of the argument. SUNO came back to me and said, Governor, that's not fair. They said our 6-year graduation rate is not 5%. They said our 6-year graduation rate is 8%. I'll round it up to 10%. My point is this. Now is the time. If we don't ask the hard questions now, if we don't make the tough decisions now, when is the right time? Anybody that looks at you and says, we can't do it now, we just got to do it next year or 5 years from now is lying to you. Because given the fiscal challenges we face this year, given the environmental, the economic challenges we face this year, if we don't make the tough choices today, we're never going to make them. And so I was proud. I was proud of the Board of Regents. They voted today. They got a consultant study yesterday. They voted today for excellence in higher education in New Orleans. I wanted to share with you one paragraph out of that entire study. You can read the study cover to cover. There was one paragraph that stands out to me, and I won't be able to quote it verbatim, but it basically says this. It says, the status quo is not acceptable. The status quo in New Orleans is not acceptable. And it says there's no reason, given the current governance or structures in place, to expect performance to improve. If you don't read the rest of the report, that's all you need to know from that report. Most important paragraph, you have an outside consultant, a national expert come in and say, status quo is not working, no reason to believe that leaving the status quo alone will result in better performance. Now they came up with two alternatives. I liked alternative B better, which involves having a university, a combined university with both the ability to be an excellent research university that drives the economy, as well as a university that serves those students that need a place to start their four-year degrees, working in partnership with Delgado, the local community college. Now there's a second group that I want to thank. We had a brave group of legislators that started this study and are going to help to get this legislation done. One of them is here today with us. Well, go ahead and clap for him, and I'll tell you who it is. Senator Conrad Appel, a year ago. Yeah, go ahead and give him a round of applause. Conrad, stand up. Let me tell you, a year ago, the senator had the wisdom, the foresight with Senator Duplessis, then Senator Duplessis, to author the resolution telling Regents to do this study, to do this assessment. And I want to congratulate him for his vision in doing that, but also his willingness, his courage to step forward even to help author the legislation in the upcoming regular session to get this done. Now, it's not going to be an easy fight. It's going to be a 2/3 vote in the House and 2/3 vote in the Senate. And at the same time we're doing this, I'm also proposing a constitutional amendment to go from 4 management boards to 1 management board. And by the way, so you know, Alternative A, the Board of Regents study, was to create a 5th management board. They apparently haven't been paying attention. I say, guys, you're the only group I know that thinks we need an additional management board to what we've already got. Now, there are a lot of people who would say, Governor, why in the world would you and Conrad want to do this in an election? That's the kind of thing you do in your second term. There are a lot of people that have said, look, you had Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Jesse Jackson came to the state. There are rumors, I don't know if it's true, that Reverend Sharpton's coming and others are coming as well to make this protest. Now, let me just tell you this. This isn't about race. It's not about politics. It's not about turf. It's not about management boards. It's about doing a better job for our students. If you were in business and you failed 92% of the time, you probably wouldn't stay in business very long. By the way, that graduation rate is not only the worst in the state, it is the worst when you compare SUNO to its regional and other peers, according to this consultant study. And there's no way to dress up that data. No matter how you look at it, we continue to rank well below where we need to be ranking to serve our community and our state. 5th and finally, we've invested in infrastructure of $3.6 billion in roads and ports in our first 18 months, more than the last 3 administrations combined. You can see some of that work here in Jefferson Parish. You can certainly see the work that's going on Causeway, the entrances on I-10. You can see the work that will be starting between Veterans and Clearview. You can see some of the other projects all around us. Bottom line is this: 39,500 new jobs in economic development. $8.5 billion in private capital investment. New Fortune 500 company headquartered in our state. A Fortune 100 company that moved their headquarters from Virginia here. Global Star moved their headquarters from Silicon Valley here. I also want to tell you about some of the challenges we face. I've shared with you the 5 steps we've got to take. We've got to continue taking to continue to improve our state and continue to do a better job in the rest of the South and the nation when it comes to economic growth. But I also want to show you a couple of challenges we face from Washington, D.C. You know, I can certainly talk to you about the closing down of Avondale because of the Navy changing the way it's buying ships, or the ending of the Constellation program cost us a couple of thousand jobs over at Michoud. But I want to talk to you about just a couple of other examples that are hurting our economy. The first, I want to tell you the story of what happened last Monday. Now, last Monday was a great day for New Orleans and for Louisiana. Saw the mayor's remarks. I was with him yesterday. He said that this was the biggest Mardi Gras in the city's history in terms of number of people and the economic impact, and it was a great time. So Monday was a great day in terms of parades and all those things. But Monday was also an important day for our state and our region for another reason. On Monday, I was over in St. James Parish with Dan D'Amico. Dan is the CEO of Newport, and we put shovels into the ground to signify the groundbreaking of what will be one of the largest economic development projects in our state's history. Newport is now committed. Newport is our country's largest steel company, and they have committed to spending up to $3.4 billion, up to 5 phases, creating 1,250 permanent jobs in St. James Parish, average pay $75,000 a year. LSU estimates when the indirect jobs are added, over 6,000 jobs. That first phase alone would be $750 million in construction, 500 construction jobs, 125 permanent jobs. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the story about Newport. 3 years ago, I started talking to the CEO of Newport to convince him to come to Louisiana. And after several months of talking to him, he finally came to me and said, "Governor, you've convinced me Louisiana is the best place for us to build this plant." We shook hands on a deal. We didn't sign anything. But he said, "Look, if you can get the permits done as quickly as possible, we're ready to move forward. We've got the money on our balance sheet. We're ready to build this thing." Several months later, after an election, the CEO came to see me personally in Baton Rouge. He said, "Governor, I have to apologize to you." He said, "I am still convinced if we build this plant in America, the best place for it is Louisiana." But he also said that because of the debate coming out of Washington, D.C., we are now thinking about building this plant in Brazil instead of America. Now, he was worried in particular about a Pelosi-led House passing a version cap and trade that would make it prohibitively expensive for him to operate his facility in this country. Now, the good news was that several months after that, earlier last year, he finally came back to me and said, "Governor, we are now convinced that these regulations aren't going to happen. We're willing to build in America, and we're coming back to Louisiana." But the reason I tell you that story, think of the construction and the other jobs that could have been created if they'd started a couple of years ago when they first wanted to build. And I tell you that because somebody's going to have to tell me how it helps our environment or our economy to send those jobs overseas. Somebody's going to have to tell me how sending billions of dollars and thousands of good-paying jobs to Brazil and other countries is good for us. The most obvious and the final example of this foolishness is the moratorium, I guess they're calling it a permatorium, going off our coast today. You know, nobody wants to see another explosion or loss of life off of our coast. Nobody wants to see another drop of oil in our waters. Now, I'll get in trouble if I start recognizing people, but I do see Billy Nungesser here, and John Young, and Chris Roberts, and some other heroes from the oil spill. Let's give these guys a round of applause. And again, I don't mean to leave anybody off, because there were several others. But your parish leaders did a phenomenal job fighting that oil spill and leading the efforts to get their parishes back on track after that crisis. Not one of these guys, and nobody in our state wants to see another explosion or loss of life. But we do want the federal government to listen to their own experts. The Department of Interior had a panel of independent experts that made dozens of recommendations about how drilling could be done more safely. They didn't recommend a moratorium. This group comes from the National Academy of Engineering and other places. These aren't my experts. These aren't the industry's experts. These are the Department of Interior's experts. We simply want them to listen to their own experts. And yeah, I know they've lifted the moratorium. They've granted out 2 deep water permits. The reality is that they used to be granting dozens of these permits. I think what concerns me the most is when I talked to the President about this last year, his words to me, and they still ring in my ears. He said to me, "Governor, don't worry about it." He said, "If people lose their jobs, BP will pay them." And he said, "Don't worry if BP," and I said, "Well, Mr. President, with all due respect, BP's not going to pay all those people." He said, "Well, don't worry about it. They can get an unemployment check." And that's the fundamental difference between Washington and Baton Rouge. They believe economic development is an unemployment check. We believe that economic development is actually putting people back to work. His advisor, Valerie Jarrett, said to me, "Governor, what are you worried about? These rigs aren't going anywhere as long as there's oil down there in the Gulf." They don't realize 7 out of 33 have already left. And you know, when you look at the unrest in the Middle East, you look at rising oil and gasoline prices, just one more reason we need to be doing everything we can to develop more energy right here at home. Now look, I believe in alternative energy, including solar and wind. We're going to have Blade Dynamics creating 600 jobs at Michoud, building the blades for wind energy. I believe in nuclear, even despite what has happened in the awful tragedy that's happened in Japan and is continuing to happen and unfold in Japan. We've got a company, Shaw, that's building the modular components for reactors in southwest Louisiana. I believe in many different forms of alternative energy and conservation, but I also believe that we need to do more to produce more oil and gas right here at home to make ourselves less dependent on these other countries abroad, especially countries that aren't always friendly to us. I'm going to close with 3 final comments. One, I do want to ask you to keep in your thoughts and prayers the poor people in Japan. I want you to remember how the world rushed to our aid after Katrina and Rita. People all over this world, many of them who had never been to Louisiana, sent money, sent assistance, sent their prayers, and sent their thoughts. Every day in the paper you can see different charities that are standing up to help the people in Japan. I'm not here to endorse any particular charity. Pick your favorite. You know, the American Red Cross is collecting resources. There are different faith-based groups collecting resources. There are different groups. But I would encourage you to do something to help. Whatever you can do to help. Maybe a financial contribution, maybe a prayer, whatever it is you can do to help, because in our time of need, people across this great world and this great country helped us. The least we can do is show them that we're not going to forget them. Second comment I want to make is this. I want to thank you. I want to thank you because y'all have worked hard. Y'all have worked hard as individuals and as a group to carry out Reagan's legacy. I want to thank you because y'all meet continuously, not only to invite speakers, but to volunteer in campaigns, to get involved in different local and statewide efforts. And I tell you, that is the importance. That is the most important thing we can do to ensure that we continue to live in the greatest country in the history of the world. To ensure that we do leave more opportunities for our children and our grandchildren that we inherited from our parents. Indeed, every one of you could be at home tonight. The only reason we come out and we volunteer in these groups and participate in these groups is we do want to leave those opportunities. You know, I described it, Superior went to a Grace King reunion a few years ago. I went to a Baton Rouge reunion a few years ago. If you haven't been to a reunion, I'd encourage you to go. You'll notice how much older everybody else has gotten. You'll also notice how many of your friends don't live in this great state anymore. So many of my friends left during the oil bust. They don't live here anymore. They live in Texas, in Georgia. When my kids grow up and go to their reunions, I don't want them traveling. I don't want them traveling from other states home. I don't want to have to only see my grandchildren at Christmas, Easter, and Thanksgiving. And that's exactly what's at risk right now. It is great we have turned a corner. We're beginning to reverse the brain drain, but we're not done. And we can't declare victory until every one of our children is able to return home. I want to close with one final story, and then I'll be done. And before I do that, I know I recognize Conrad. We've got several other members of the delegation here, and I don't know if they've been recognized before I got here, but I do want to recognize them because they do a great job for you. They've been great friends to my administration, and I know that they're going to work together with me to make sure that we don't raise your taxes and we continue to grow our state. So let me ask these guys to stand up so we can give them a round of applause. I know we've got Johnny here, we've got Walker in the back, we've got Representative Nick LaRusso, we've got Kirk Talbot, we got several of these guys. We got Tony Lee in the back. We got Senator Danny Martini over here. We got Tom Wilmot over here. We've got, if I missed anybody, it's Conrad. No, I'm just kidding. It's Danny's fault. He heads up the Republican delegation. But I want to close with one final story and I'll be done. Yeah, I talk a lot about my kids. I just want to close with one final story about my kids and I'll be done. I'll turn over the mic to whoever's turn it is. You know, one of the things, I don't know about you, but when you have young children, they tend to fall into certain rituals. My kids, they get home from school in the afternoon. And when they get home, my little girl, she does her homework. The boys, they'll go outside and play. Around 6:30, they'll sit down and eat dinner. We sit down and eat dinner as a family. After dinner, they'll go and take their baths. Now, my little girl, she scrubs herself so clean. You would think she was going into surgery. I mean, she is just the cleanest little girl. The boys, you got to watch them. They'll come out of the bath. They won't even touch the soap. It's amazing. The only boys I know, you can put in the water and they'll come out dirtier than when they started. It's an amazing thing. They come out afterwards, they'll play a little bit. My little girl might study a few more last minutes for her test. And then they finally go brush their teeth. And then they say their prayers. And by the way, one of my favorite times at night is to sit down and listen to my children pray. You learn so much about your children listening to their prayers. Every night our little children, they'll do a Lord's Prayer, and then they can pray to God however they want. They can tell God whatever happened to them that day, and I love listening to them as they do that. My youngest, when he was 3, one night he was sitting down there, he was kneeling at his bed, he was saying his prayers, he gets through the Lord's Prayer, and right at the end, without pausing, without taking a breath, he launches right into the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, I don't know what to do. Like, you know, are you supposed to stand up and put your hand on your heart? Are you supposed to stay on your knees? He gets to the end, he's so proud of himself, he yells, "Amen." I just yelled, "Amen." I didn't know what else to do. I was confused until I realized a few days later, he goes to a daycare, Christian daycare in the morning, every morning. They say the Lord's Prayer, and then they say the Pledge of Allegiance. Every morning. He thinks it's one long prayer. He doesn't know. I'm sorry, I just saw Senator Julie Quinn is here too as well. Let's give her a round of applause. Julie, they didn't whistle like that for Tom or anything like that. I must like her better. But they, before they go to bed, we'll also read to our children as well. We'll read to them, and when they're old enough, they read to us. Just kind of a tradition. I'll tell you what, my little girl, she reads everything. The boys, especially Sean, he is 6. He won't read a book unless it's about the Saints or the Tigers. He has read every sports book there is, but he just hates, he won't read anything else. He's just at that age. So I remember one night I was putting him to bed, and he found a book with his name on it. He was so excited about this. He said, Daddy, read me my book. I said, well, all right, this is pretty... I went and found this book. It was actually a book that had been given to us as a gift when he was born. It was a fancy ceremonial Bible. It was actually the King James Version of the Bible. And I thought, he's not going to want me to read this to him. I mean, the language is tough. I mean, he's 6 years old. He's not going to sit still for this. But he insisted, so I opened it to the first page, opened it Genesis 1, and started reading it to him. And to my surprise, he actually enjoyed it. It was interesting, and he liked it. He actually explained the words. It was great. He was learning vocabulary. He was learning the biblical stories. I thought this was great. A few nights later, he found another book that had been given to him when he was born. It was a children's version of the Bible, and it allowed him to read to me. He said, Daddy, you read me the big person's book, I'll read you the children's version. And he was reading me stories. It was great. It became our little tradition every night. Now look, with my job, I don't get home every night before my kids go to bed. I try to do that as often as I can, but a lot of times by the time I get home, they're already in bed. And so those nights, Supreme, my wife takes care of all 3 kids, and that can be a handful. You know, they outnumber the parents. It gets pretty tough. So I get home one night, and my wife is waiting for me, almost at the door. She says, do you know what your boys did today? I'm going to tell you something. To the men in this room, when your wife tells you, do you know what my child did today? That means they've done something good. When she says, do you know what your boys have done? That's never a good sign. They're always my boys when they've done something bad. I said, I hadn't even got inside yet. I said, no, what have they done? And she said, well, they were behaving like such angels. Because, you know, the 6 and the 4-year-old, the 2 boys, they're either best friends or they fight. There's no in between. You know, they're just at that age. They're so close in age, they either get along or they fight like cats and dogs. She said they were getting along so great tonight. Sean was so good to his younger brother. She was being nice to him. She was sharing with him. So when it came time to get ready for bed, Sean wanted to read to his younger brother. I said, well, that's great. Those are my boys. I said, well, what are you mad at me for? She said, well, do you remember where you left off in the Bible when you were reading to Sean? I don't remember. I said, honestly, I don't know. I said, she goes, well, where? I said, we were in Genesis. And she said, well, how many chapters did you do in Genesis? I said, I probably did about through the 3rd chapter or so. She said, well, you remember what happens in the 3rd chapter in Genesis? I said, I don't, look, off the top of my head, I said, I can go look it up for you. I don't remember. She said, I wasn't paying attention. I was putting your daughter to bed. And I turned around and realized Sean had just read the story of Cain and Abel to his younger brother. She made me go wake him up and tell him he wasn't allowed to kill his younger brother. Look, the reason we all work so hard to leave a better state for our children and our grandchildren is because of those children we go home to. It's because we want to make sure they don't have to leave this great state to pursue their dreams. We inherited the greatest set of opportunities in the greatest state and the greatest country in the history of the world. It is our job to leave it even better for our children and our grandchildren. So thank you for honoring Reagan's legacy. Thank you for the great work you do. But most importantly, thank you for believing in a better Louisiana for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you all very much.